A black boy helped a millionaire change a flat tire asking for nothing in return. The next day, a black SUV appeared in front of his house, and what happened next moved the entire neighborhood. David sat behind the wheel of his SUV, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. The road stretched out in front of him, empty, flanked by tall grass swaying in the summer heat. He looked at his watch, muttering under his breath he had a meeting in less than an hour, an important one. But as the car sped along the narrow rural road, there came a jarring bump, followed by the unmistakable thump, thump, thump of a flat tire. Of course, just perfect, he said, his voice dripping with frustration. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road, his luxury vehicle kicking up a cloud of dust. The heat hit him as soon as he stepped out, and he winced, adjusting his suit jacket and loosening his tie. David knelt beside the tire. It was clearly shredded, pieces of rubber peeling away. He glanced down the empty road and back at his phone. No signal. He cursed under his breath, tucking the phone back into his pocket. He stared at the tire, feeling helpless. He'd never had to change one himself before in his world. Someone always handled these kinds of issues, assistants, chauffeurs, service crews. But out here on this deserted road, with no cell signal, there was no one. Just him, his broken-down SUV, and the sweltering heat. David's thoughts drifted back reluctantly a long time ago. When he was a young man, he'd been in a similar situation, stranded and needing help. He remembered the faces of the people who ignored him, then who looked the other way. It left a bitter taste, a reason he hated relying on others. He shook his head, shoving the memory aside. The sun beat down harder, the road shimmered in the distance, and the tension in his chest grew. The sky above was clear, and the nearest sign of civilization seemed far away. He needed to find a solution before the day turned into dusk. Suddenly, David squinted. Something, or rather someone, was moving towards him, a silhouette on the horizon, getting closer. He straightened up, trying to make out the figure. It was a kid no more than 14, wearing a faded t-shirt and a pair of old sneakers. As the boy got closer, David could see his determined expression. "Hey, mister, got trouble with your car?" the boy called out, stopping a few steps away from the SUV. He was looking right at David, his eyes clear and curious. David hesitated. He felt a strange mix of relief and caution. "Yeah, flat tire," he said, trying to keep his voice level, "and I don't exactly know how to fix it." The boy nodded, moving closer. He glanced at the shredded rubber and then at David. "I can do it. My dad showed me how." He dropped to his knees, inspecting the tie. "Got a spare?" David frowned. "You wait, you can really do it?" He stared at the boy. He seemed sure of himself, but David wasn't used to relying on strangers, much less a kid. The boy looked up, smiled slightly. "Yeah, it's just a tire, mister, no big deal." He stood up, dusting his knees off. "The spare is usually under the back. Mind if I take a look?" David gave a short nod, feeling uneasy, but without any other option, he stepped aside, watching as the boy moved confidently to the back of the SUV. Opening the hatch, he saw the kid find the tools and the spare. Not hesitating for a moment, David stood there, unsure of what to do with his hands. He glanced down at the boy, who had already begun loosening the lug nuts, the wrench moving back and forth with a rhythmic clank. "You're really doing this?" David murmured, more to himself. He could feel sweat forming on his back, a combination of the heat and the unease he felt from this situation. The boy worked quickly, ignoring the dirt and the weight of the tire. After some time, he looked up, a bit of sweat dripping down his forehead. "You all right there, mister? You're looking kind of pale." David cleared his throat, straightened his suit jacket. "I'm fine, just not used to this kind of thing." The boy smiled again, and David couldn't help but notice how genuine it was. "It's no problem, really. You just got to know where to look and how to get your hands dirty." David stayed silent, watching as the kid finished attaching the spare tire. He worked quickly, tightening the bolts, and finally stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He took a step back and gave David a thumbs up. "All done." David blinked, almost in disbelief. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He took out a few bills, holding them out to the boy. "Here for your trouble. I appreciate it." The boy shook his head, immediately backing away. "Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help. You seemed like you could use it." David frowned, holding the money there, his hand hanging awkwardly. "No, really, I insist." But the boy just smiled, shook his head again, and started to walk away, waving over his shoulder, "Take care, Mr. Good luck with wherever you're going." David watched stunned as the boy disappeared down the road the same way he had come. The bills were still in his hand. He stood there for a moment, then let out a long breath. The unease hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown. He wasn't used to this. A simple favor with no expectation of reward. He turned back to the SUV, slipping the money back into his wallet. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, the boy's form getting smaller and smaller until it was gone completely. David drove on, but his thoughts were anything but clear. Something about that encounter wouldn't let him go. A nagging feeling, a sense of being unsettled. He pressed his lips together, focusing on the road ahead, trying to shove the thoughts away, but they stuck with him long after he left. The empty road behind, David's mind wandered as he drove, replaying the entire encounter over and over again. The boy's smile, the way he refused the money, the casual "take care" he threw over his shoulder. It felt wrong somehow, not the boy's actions, but David's own reaction. He wasn't used to not being in control, to not having the power that money brought. He pulled into his driveway, the automatic gates opening. As his luxury SUV rumbled through, the house loomed ahead, modern, sleek, the kind of place where everything looked perfect but felt cold. David parked, shutting off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring blankly out of the windshield. "Hey hun, you're late." David looked up, startled out of his thoughts by his wife Clara standing at the door. She was smiling, but her expression shifted slightly as she saw his face. She stepped closer, concern creasing her brow. "Everything all right?" Yeah, David said quickly, forcing a smile. He grabbed his briefcase and climbed out, shutting the door harder than he meant to. Had some trouble on the road, just a flat. Clara folded her arms, tilting her head. "A flat tire. Did you manage to fix it?" "No." He hesitated, then added, "A kid showed up. He fixed it for me." He gave a small shrug, trying to sound casual. "Didn't want anything for it." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Didn't want anything, really?" David nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Refused the money I offered him, just helped and left." She studied him for a moment. "That's kind of amazing, actually. People aren't usually that nice for nothing these days." David just grunted in response, stepping past her into that house. "Yeah, well, I guess." He wasn't sure why, but her words irritated him. Maybe it was because she was right. Maybe it was because he knew he would never have done the same. The evening moved on, but the strange feeling refused to leave him. At dinner, he barely touched his food. His two kids, Ellie and Josh, were chattering about their day, but their voices felt distant, muffled. Clara noticed, giving him a wary glance. "All right, what's going on?" she asked, leaning her elbows on the table. "You've been acting weird since you got home." David looked up, blinking. He shook his head. "It's nothing, just I don't know." He paused, the words almost catching in his throat. "It's that kid. I can't stop thinking about it." Ellie, his daughter, looked up from her phone, her curiosity piqued. "What kid?" David sighed. He set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. "I told you, the kid that helped me with the tire. He wouldn't take any money. He just did it like it was the most normal thing in the world. And then he walked away." He rubbed his forehead, trying to make sense of his own frustration. I don't understand it." Josh, his son, smirked. "Maybe he's just a good person, Dad." David shot him a look, but didn't respond. Clara watched him carefully, her expression softening. "Sometimes people do good things just because they can." David, "Not everyone expects something in return." David frowned. "Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Everyone wants something." He stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape. "Anyway, I'm going to get some air." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes following him as he walked out to the backyard. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, looking out at the manicured lawn. He wanted to dismiss it, to forget about the kid and move on, but there was something there, something he couldn't shake. The look in the boy's eyes, the way he just smiled and walked away as if helping was enough. David went to bed late that night, his thoughts still in disarray. Clara was asleep by the time he finally climbed in beside her. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the nagging sense of incompleteness. It was just a flat tire. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, but somehow it did. The next morning, David woke up with a sense of purpose, even Even if he couldn't quite put his finger on why he had to find the boy, he didn't know what he would say or even if the kid would be there. But he had to try. He got dressed quickly, throwing on casual clothes instead of his usual suit. Clara looked up from her coffee, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. Going somewhere? David nodded, already heading for the door. I'm going back to where I got the flat. Clara blinked. To find the kid? Yeah, David said, pausing at the door. He gave her a quick smile. Don't wait up for me. He climbed back into the SUV, his mind focused. He remembered the stretch of road, the feeling of helplessness. When he first saw the tire was flat, it didn't take long to get there, but the landscape seemed different today, less threatening, more familiar. David slowed the car as he approached the spot. He parked on the side, stepping out, and looked around. The sun was already warming the air, and he could feel sweat gathering on his neck. He scanned the distance, his eyes narrowing, and then he saw it, a house, small and worn, standing back from the road. He walked towards it, feeling a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. What if he was wrong? What if it wasn't the boy's house? He shook the thought away. Kept walking. The front yard was unkempt, a few rusted toys scattered around. David stopped at the edge of the walkway, taking a deep breath. Before stepping up to the door, he raised his hand, knocking firmly. There was a rustling from inside, and then the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked at David, his expensive shoes, the watch on his wrist, the determined look on his face. Can I help you? She asked, her voice cautious. David cleared his throat. Yeah, I'm looking for a kid, 14, I think. He helped me with my car yesterday. The woman's expression softened. She nodded slightly. You mean Lucas? David nodded. Yes, Lucas. I wanted to thank him properly. The woman stepped back, glancing over her shoulder. Lucas, come here. Someone's here for you. David heard footsteps, and then Lucas appeared, his eyes widening in recognition. Oh, hey, mister, he said, a smile breaking across his face. David took a step forward. Lucas, I wanted to find you. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what you did for me yesterday. I need to do something for you in return. Lucas shook his head, the smile never leaving his face. I told you, mister, it was no big deal. I just wanted to help. David looked at him, trying to understand the sincerity, the kindness. It was so foreign to him, but he knew he couldn't leave it like this. Please, David said. There has to be something I can do for you, for your family. Lucas glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod. He looked back at David, his eyes thoughtful. Well, he said slowly, maybe there is one thing. David felt a flicker of hope. Anything, he said quickly, whatever you need. Lucas's smile grew wider. How about you come in for breakfast? We don't have much, but it would be nice. David blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then nodded. All right, I'd like that. The door swung open wider, and David stepped inside, feeling something shift within him. He didn't know what it was, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. David sat at the modest wooden table in Lucas's kitchen. The place was small, tidy, but worn. The scent of coffee and eggs filled the air. Lucas's mother moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to being in a setting like this. Everything about it felt alien. Lucas sat across from David, a grin still on his face. So what brings you back, really? Lucas asked, his curiosity evident. David scratched his chin, choosing his words carefully. I couldn't get yesterday out of my mind, he said. He glanced around the kitchen at the simple curtains, the cracked linoleum floor. You helped me, and I wanted to repay you somehow. It just didn't sit right with me leaving it like that. Lucas shrugged, taking a sip of his juice. It's really no big deal. I mean, we're supposed to help each other, right? David paused. The simplicity of Lucas's words made him feel almost foolish. His entire life had been built on the idea that nothing came for free, that every action had a price, a return, an angle. Yet here was Lucas, treating kindness as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lucas's mom set a plate in front of David. Scrambled eggs and toast. It's not much, but you're welcome to it, she said, offering him a gentle smile. David looked down at the plate, then back up at her. He swallowed, nodding. Thank you, it's more than enough. They ate in silence for a few moments, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound. David kept glancing at Lucas, the way the boy interacted with his mom, the warmth in his eyes. It was such a stark contrast to the way his own household had felt lately, cold, distant, more like a transaction than a family. Lucas looked up suddenly, his eyes catching David's. So, what's it like, being successful and all that? David paused, chewing thoughtfully. It's busy, he said finally. A lot of meetings, a lot of responsibility. He looked at Lucas, seeing the curiosity there. I guess most people think it's all fancy parties and luxury, but it can be pretty lonely. Lucas nodded slowly. I get that. I mean, people probably see the fancy car and think you've got it all right. David smiled slightly, a bitter edge to it. Yeah, something like that. He looked down at his plate, pushing the eggs around. Sometimes I think I've lost sight of what really matters, the things that make life worth it. Lucas tilted his head, considering. Maybe you just need a reminder. He smiled again, that same open, genuine smile, helping someone, being there. It feels good, right? David blinked, taken aback. He said, fork down, nodding slowly. Yeah, it does. Lucas's mom cleared her throat softly, breaking the moment. We don't have much, but we try to help when we can. It's how my mom raised me, and it's how I'm raising Lucas. David nodded, glancing at her, then back at Lucas. You've done a good job, he said, his voice sincere. Lucas is a good kid. The room fell into a comfortable silence. The king David wasn't used to it. He leaned back in his chair, letting himself relax for the first time in what felt like a long time. It wasn't about the luxury or the material things. It was just about being there, sharing a meal, connecting. As the meal finished, Lucas stood up, taking David's empty plate and stacking it with his own. So what now, mister? You going to be all right? He asked, a teasing smile playing on his lips. David let out a small laugh, shaking his head. I think so, but he hesitated, then looked Lucas in the eye. I really do want to do something for you, for your family, not because I owe you, but because I want to. Lucas exchanged a look with his mother. She gave a small, encouraging nod. Lucas turned back to David, shrugging. I mean, we could use a few things around here, but it's not why